enjoy that once in a while. It was stuff that came from interest groups. We looked and we said, what's to report? What are activists looking at? What's important to people right now? So that's our main type of content that we had, and then we did something called In Other News, and these were news briefs that were like 1 or 2 paragraphs, and world news and U.S. news sections. Those were the main ones, and then down here we had world news, U.S. news, we had a photo of the day, we had a cartoon of the day, a video of the day. These were all mostly offsite links, or the cartoonists we usually worked with directly. We had a commentary that was always an offsite link. Wasn't even something that we were interested in. It was just, like, the worst part of Jessica's job was finding like progressive commentary that was worth showing anybody. Then we had down here, recent stuff. Oh, here's another thing that made us unique. This was the thing that everyone would always say. Well, I will get into this later. We're going to talk a lot about why we didn't take ads and how we funded ourselves. But we were very proud of the fact that there weren't ads, so we advertised that there weren't ads. And then at the end, what we were trying to do was get a lot more people to come here as sort of their homepage. We wanted you to make this their homepage. And early on, we had mostly just this stuff, and we weren't covering the shit that everyone needed to talk about at the quote-unquote water cooler. So when you're at work, what are people talking about? We never went so far as to link to actual total garbage, like, Paris Hilton type stuff. But we did give people links to offsite stuff that they'd probably be hearing about that we didn't think there was, the coverage was either fine about, or it was just just worth reading. This was a significant thing. Prez says was, yeah. This was fun. What we realized early on was that whatever the White House was saying was usually the top of the news everywhere else, and it made no sense. It never made any sense. If the White House did something, that's worth reporting. But the fact that the White House wanted to set a news agenda that really did set everybody's agenda, and if you looked at the front page, this was on the front page for everybody else. We buried it here and we linked to their version of it because it was utter garbage. And it wouldn't have mattered who was president, that's where we would have put it. And then in the doghouse was a little column that I wrote that was critiquing other news organizations for failing at reaching the standards that we believed that we were setting as a tiny little nonprofit. New York Times was often in there. I loved hitting your independent because they really should have known better, and they often didn't. And this was just contextual stuff. We were just really trying to draw people in. You'll notice here that we had a corrections thing on the front page. The front page of our website had corrections. Anytime there was a significant correction of a story, it stayed here for 7 days. And it was a mark of shame on whoever the editor was, or editors, and whoever the reporter was. And so we tried to keep this empty, and it stayed there. And often it wasn't empty. Okay, that's a basic rundown. I think you have a general idea of what we produced. And now we're going to largely just talk about how we produced it and what elements of it might work with you folks. So we'll do a quick go around and find out what projects you're working with, if any, and if there's any particular interest of some way that you think that this might relate to how you're doing this document.
Yeah, I'm unemployed at the moment, so I write for independent media in the US, like small country.
Okay.
And yeah, I speak in this country. Yeah, so it's all fun there.
I'm not a student right now, I'm doing visual anthropology masters, but I'm working on trying to create a new kind of open access academic anthropology journal, with some really interesting business model particularly. So something to sustain maybe having some kind of staff in the future, but right now we're open access and it's all autonomized by academics who just volunteer their time. So right now it's free and it's fine, but we would like to move towards getting people who can pay or maybe work on staff. So that's what I'm particularly interested in.
My name is Anita, and I was an activist in the United States until about a couple months ago. I'm living in France now, but I usually suggest CNET for a lot of things, so I'm interested in knowing alternative forms of gaining access to news and trying to share that with other friends and people that I know, but currently not working on a project.
I write case paper, the left papers or websites that are around. I'd like for us to have a proper left-wing newspaper. So I'm just learning. I don't know how to do specific projects.
two hats on really. I'm here on behalf of the local Stop the War group and do their newsletter. We're just interested in new means of getting messages out there. But I'm also a freelance journalist. At one point wanted to work on Fleet Street, but kind of got disillusioned because of all the crap and the misinterpretation of facts and the disinformation. So kind of went down another route and went into other areas. I've recently started blogging, and I've found that the stuff that I, different subjects, but the stuff that I do on kind of radical subjects, stuff that's not covered in the mainstream media, has had quite a lot of hits, significantly more than the other stuff I'm blogging about. So it's got me interested, thinking, well, maybe there's this niche here. People want to read a kind of more radical take on stuff that either isn't in the mainstream news or is only given one sentence or something.
Hey, I'm Mark. I'm a PhD student in Ireland, and my area of research is Ireland's public service broadcaster and the extent to which its news output has anything to do with public service.
Checker, I often call my reporter sources to check the quotes by them. If the reporter hadn't recorded the interview, I went and double-checked reporters' sourcing of primary documents, etc.
What did the sources say when you called?
Sources were like, really? No one ever calls me to check the sources. They were totally surprised and impressed.
All the
I
time.
just kept thinking, well, here are these huge news organizations that have so much more staff, and they can't be bothered to call the sources and run things by them and make sure. I mean, another thing that we did was when a journalist paraphrased the source instead of quoting directly from them, we ran that paraphrase by the source to make sure that they're being represented properly and their words weren't being taken out of context or the readers weren't being misled. So how did we find the stories? We had a lot of different ways that we found stories. A main way was by reading press releases from pretty much everywhere we could find. A lot of times from activist groups and advocacy organizations and groups that were also advocating for the public interest. We also read the news like crazy. We read alternative media, we read mainstream media every day, and we read between the lines and sort of asked ourselves questions like, what are the angles that aren't being covered here? What more do we want to know? Or what does the public need to know about this issue in order to be more informed about it? And so a lot of our stories started by reading horrible corporate news articles and sort of being like, all right, well, let's cover this from a completely different angle and go talk to the people that were clearly missing from this story. Our sources, we encouraged our reporters to look at a variety of sources. First and foremost, we look to talk to the people most affected and impacted by the event or policy that we were reporting on. So, if it was a story about evictions, we would find people who were affected by evictions and interview them to get make it clear to our readers what the personal impact of these policies were. Then we would look for people who were researchers or who had written studies, or just had a broader view of, let's say, evictions again, who could put evictions in a context and tell us how many evictions were happening in the country, who the main actors were, etc. We also talked to advocates, people who were working in activist groups. An example. You're writing a story about cuts to child care subsidies for mothers on public assistance. So obviously you want to interview mothers on public assistance who are going to be affected by these cuts. In general, you would want to use interviews with people directly affected by the policy to convey personal stories to the reader about what life is like on public assistance and what life is like after these cuts. Since advocates work with hundreds of mothers likely to be affected by the policy change, they can be used to put personal stories into a broader context. Independent analysts, those are the researchers I was talking about, provide another layer of context based on more objective study. And you would not want to quote a mother giving statistics on how much each person on public assistance stands to lose from the policy, unless the mother also happens to be a researcher. And you would also not want to quote an analyst on how it feels to leave a child in substandard daycare, unless the analyst has had that experience. So, you know, a mother might say something really interesting or really compelling, but would not be that person's area of expertise, and we were really careful not to kind of mix the expertise of sources and stories. That was really important to us.
And you'd be surprised how often they try
And you'd be
to
surprised if you're...
overextend their knowledge, their expertise.
But also you'll be surprised if you're kind of aware of this issue and you go read alternative and mainstream media, how often sources are used inappropriately. And you know, you'll see statistics or whatever quoted by somebody who's clearly not a researcher, and it doesn't appear that the journalist went out of their way to go look up those studies or verify if that information was accurate at all. I want to talk a little bit about balance. I don't know if this is true in the UK, but in the US there's kind of an obsession in the media with balance. And in the corporate media, that often balance means getting the sides of the stories, but of course not all the sides, but all the legitimate sides in their eyes, and just kind of putting both sides out there equally and not really doing any analysis, and you know, you decide what's the truth. And I think the global warming example is the best example. You know, is global warming actually happening, and is it caused by humans? Scientist A says yes, scientist B says no, you decide. And to us, balance meant something completely different. To us, first of all, if a source was clearly not saying something accurate, they usually didn't make it into the story, and if they did, they were challenged. We would point out in the narrative the research that was done that overturned whatever they had said. And you know, also if 90% of scientists say one thing and 10% of scientists say another, it's probably less than 10% at this point. 2% now. You know, we felt that they should get sort of proportionate room in the article as well. Do you have
And if
anything
the article
to
doesn't
add?
have 100 sentences in it, it's not clear that you actually have to convey that somehow.
Do you have other things to add about how we balance sources and other examples?
Well, we also thought that balance in the story meant what Jessica's already described, which is just not sides of the issue, but voices. So we tried to balance the expert, quote-unquote, objective, or high-up voice policymaker type people with real voices of real people who are affected, and that was I think that was really a lot of what we considered balance was. Do you get a balanced view of this, not sides of the story as much as quality, the qualitative approach to, what are we conveying an actual story here?
And we really, I mean, this was a very conscious decision. We really talked about the weight of sources in an article and where the balance should lie. And our general policy was to weight stories toward people most affected by the issue. And then the last thing I just want to talk about, I mean, I've touched on a little bit, was just accuracy. Our feeling was that, even if we might want something to be true, or we might want to be able to put something in print, but unless it was accurate, unless we could back it up with some kind of research or fact-checking or study, etc., it didn't make it in. And we were really careful about pretty much everything that was written in the article was fact-checked. And once we started doing that, and once we started, because a lot of our stories started with stories that we would read in the corporate media, we were constantly fact-checking the corporate media. And we were constantly fact-checking the alternative left media. And it's really scary how little of substance there is in pretty much either, and how little fact-checking and verification goes into those publications. So we were really careful about that. We really wanted our readers to be able to trust our reporting. Anything else to add to the
I think to clarify when Jessica says pretty much everything was fact checked, the threshold was sort of insane. If you wanted to say the African country of Nigeria, we didn't have to look up to just make sure, absolutely sure that Nigeria is in Africa, but that's kind of where it ended. If we were going to mention the capital city of something, even if we knew, how many times did we know that we knew something and that the reporter was right, it sounded right, everything's right? When we would look it up, if it wasn't something that we were really absolutely sure that it was so obvious, like Nigeria is in Africa, we would go through point by point by point and look things up. And the reason that we did that was because we got burned a bunch of times, and the more we got burned, like in terms of just little things like that. Like the first time it happened was a reporter used Afghani as a reference to a person from Afghanistan. Totally improper. They're Afghan. The word Afghani means one thing. It's a unit of currency. And I got like 6 emails about it, and was like, holy crap! They're Afghanis, aren't they? I mean, I've been reading about Afghanistan for like 15 freaking years, and hadn't picked up on that. So we would go through everything: proper nouns, spelling, all that kind of stuff. And you're thinking right now, holy shit, that's a ton of work. Yeah, it was a ton of work, and we could. That's why the space down here was empty most of the time, I think. This thing we tried to keep empty, and the little corrections would have to stay up there, I think, for 3 days.
Yeah,
Like,
we
this
like
thing, if we
spelled
spelled it
it.
wrong, if we spelled something wrong, it went there. And we were so proud of it, and we challenged everybody else. We were like, why doesn't the New York Times do this? New York Times, you have plenty of ads on your freaking front page, because they started doing that. Why don't you stick a little box in there, at least telling us where to look for the full version of the correction? Because we were linking to a full version, and it would be extensive, and sometimes self-deprecating. Although we usually try to stay civilized about it. I think,
Do you have any questions about news gathering that we did?
Yeah, did you give yourselves a deadline for turning stories around? I mean, obviously that's a lot of work going into that in a small team.
We did, but we didn't hold ourselves to the deadlines. If we had different sizes of stories, I mean, we did publish different lengths of stories. We sort of had, shorter news articles that were expected to have a shorter turnaround. And then we had feature articles that went looking for broader context. And, we didn't rush things to print if they weren't ready. If something wasn't ready by the deadline, we didn't just publish it. So we did try, when we were assigning stories to our reporters, and really they're assigning them to themselves because they're managing reporters, we would kind of set out, okay, well, this is going to, it looks like this is going to be a short article, and it will be turned around in a day or two. But of course, if they came back and said, actually, this is a much bigger issue than we thought, as I've been looking into it, or there's this really crucial source and I haven't been able to reach them, they're on vacation until next week, we would hold the story until, and sometimes, there were a few times that we went without publishing anything during the day because the story just wasn't ready. And we often published, varying numbers of stories based on what was ready at the time.
And you can imagine the agony of not publishing something that we had in hand because 1 or 2 little things weren't ready yet. But we needed, we called ourselves a NewStandard for a reason, and it was a pretty pompous name, and so we tried to live up to it, basically.
There's one other thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't talk about, which was...
So can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
On that topic,
What you just said, which is, I'm not entirely clear what daily means in case of an electronic publication. And you kind of answered it just now by saying kind of that you publish something every day. I mean, there was a story change every day. Is that basically what you mean altogether? Or, becoming, if you look at things in terms of the flow of stories in a printed publication, where there's this week's stories and next week's stories, it's weekly. Electronic publication, presumably you're not scrapping everything when you put something new in, you're constantly rejigging the page. So, is it possible to say, or am I using the wrong terms, kind of like how often the whole paper was sort of renovated, or not renovated, but changed? I mean,
Yeah, well, actually, there's two answers to that. First is that it changed like 6 or 7 times. What we meant by daily publishing, sometimes it was revolving. Sometimes we posted stories at 2 in the morning if they came, if they were done at 2 in the morning or whatever. Some day at the end it was kind of. At the end it was kind of try to get at the very least this story changed. You can see this was from the day before. Often it was three full-length, new, fresh, originally reported stories here. But it was whatever we could do. But the second response I have to that is that I don't know I have no reason to tell you that we were doing it right. It's not something that we're particularly proud of, like the style of how we presented stuff. I don't know if it was right or wrong. It's going to be different for every publication. So that's how we did it. But
I mean, we kind of did think in terms of days, like what's going to be the fresh content.
And it was Monday through Friday.
And we did try to publish in the morning. By the time we had a daily email that went out. Did it go out in the morning? I think it went out in the morning. I mean, the idea was that people would get to work and it would be in their inbox. It had like our latest original articles and our the news section.
With a link to
Oh yes, yeah, with links,
Yeah, with
even
links
directly
back.
to the articles.
It was like the little
And-
teasers and then links to the articles.
And we weren't going to catch them at coffee before work, but it was 9 a.m. Eastern time. Then folks in the other time zones would be picking it up early. That was our goal, and we met it a lot for a scattered, underpaid workforce.
Sorry, I missed that, but so you ran from 2003, was it, till 2007?
January 1st, 2004 till April 27th, 2007, so 3 and a quarter
Why
years.
did you stop? What happened?
We'll get to that. We'll definitely get to that.
There's one more thing that I think is crucial about our approach to news, which is we considered ourselves, I don't know if we thought about this after the fact, but I like to say that we were radical reporters, and I do know that we put that into practice. And what that meant was we looked for the roots of issues. And that is part of why the news gathering process was so laborious. We really did look to try to figure out what institutional forces are really happening behind this story. What are the root causes of, these horrible things that are happening to people that we're reporting on? And finding sources and data to discuss those institutional forces that were happening behind stories was really hard. And it made the news gathering process a little more complex. But it's something I'm really proud of, that we really did put things in a larger context to help people understand what really was happening in the economy or in society or in the government, etc., behind the story. And that's something you don't see much in the corporate media at all.
This was built into how we did the news, and everything that Jessica just described pretty much is in the style guide that we produced, or the reporter's manual, journalist manual.
Content Contributors Handbook.
No wonder it was a bestseller.
You came up with it.
I'll accept that. Our Content Contributors Handbook is online today on the front page of the
Rebellious
Media Conference website, and on news.The. Our entire archive is still online. It's not in the exact format that it used to be, but you can still search and find all real examples of the way we did it. But that Content Contributors Handbook with that nice sexy name is yours to download, rewrite. It's anti-copyright. You can do whatever you want with it. If there's any part of it that can be used as instructive for the work that you're doing, please do. And we'd love to hear about what you like and don't like about it too. So, what you won't like about it is that it's brutal. And the last thing I want to say about the editing process, Jessica was, one of our first, the first woman that we brought on, her name was Simone. Okay, anyway, she and Jessica really set the standard that was much higher than I intended for it to be for this news project. In fact, the first stories that I edited got torn apart by them. They were like, well, did you call this person? Did you call that person? I'm like, what the hell? How am I supposed to do this? Like, I can't do this. But they were doing it, so I had to step up. And the women were leading were setting this standard that was so high. And Jessica started getting this reputation with the reporters as being someone that they all wanted to work with. They might have been a little relieved when they got to work with me because I was a little gentler on them maybe, but I didn't push them as well as Jessica did. And Jessica, as a news editor, for someone who'd never done it before, was almost right out of the gate one of the best editors I've ever heard about. And she pressed journalists, but she also gave them the space that they needed to develop. She figured out where they were at, and she would help them adjust their story so that it fit to them. And so we really tailored the process, because a lot of our journalists were first-time writers. A lot of them were professionals who were pouring out of the mainstream and were willing to work for $150 to write a story that we were going to brutalize them in a way that they'd never been dealt with by an editor before. And they were sitting there saying, I've worked in the corporate media, I can't believe you're asking me these questions. They kind of loved it and they kind of hated it, because they were finally doing the job that they were trained to do all along, all those years of journalism school. And they'd get out of journalism school, go to work for a mainstream paper, do it for years, come to us and actually have to put a lot of stuff that they learned into practice and realize, oh my God, I spent all that time learning how to do this and no one ever actually made me do it. And we heard that over and over again. And the level of, and we'll talk about our workplace structure is next, but the workplace structure of having a collective actually raised the standard instead of what you might expect would be to lower it. But we ended, because we're kind of all nudge, like if we all make this easier on each other, we can all have an easier work day. We sort of one-upped each other, and it was a very, almost competitive. It was kind of like, it wasn't ever spoken, but it was like the idea was you didn't want to be the one who screwed up that day. So I felt competitive. I don't know. I was dealing with people who were so good at what they were doing that I knew I had to stay on my toes. So anyway, I think that the editing process is what's missing from a lot of journalism. And we consider that journalists are editors and reporters are editors, and they're two parts of the same team and they have to work together. So we had an assignment editor who was the person that you dealt with day to day, but then I was the main copy editor, so I followed through and made sure that stories were of consistent style and that we didn't have a lot of editorializing and buzzwords and doublespeak and that kind of stuff.
Pretty much every piece of content went through 3 editors. There was a primary editor, which was usually me, unless I was the reporter and then it was somebody else in the collective, who really helped develop the story and did the fact-checking and stuff like that. And then there was a secondary editor that once the primary editor signed off on this thing and said, okay, I think this is good, another editor, which was usually another reporter, would read through it and have usually another round of questions about it or thoughts. And then when that was done, it went to the copy editor for the final proofread. So it was a pretty...
The reporters were just so tired of the stories by the time they went to print, because some of them got used to it and really knew how to get ahead of this process and would footnote their articles. I mean, stuff comes in academic form, which you'll never see in a newsroom. You won't see footnotes in the newsroom at all. Stuff would come in footnoted. One of our reporters was so thorough that it was almost annoying. It was like, okay, you don't have to footnote that Nigeria is a country in Africa, like we get. But that process made it easier. But when they would first see it, they'd just be like, I can't believe there's another round. Wait, they'd be like, what? You want me to look at this again? Like, oh my God, can't you just throw it up there? Some of them were the opposite and were really eager about that, but it depended person to person.
On that process of editing and fact-checking, was there a danger that you could undermine your contributors in the eyes of their sources? How did you avoid doing that?
Because we were calling the sources and just making sure.
Yeah.
I don't think that our sources, from the many sources that I spoke to, I was very polite about it. I just said, I'm an editor at NewStandard and so interviewed you and I'm just, calling to make sure that this paraphrase is okay with you, etc. They were really appreciative.
The only thing that ever came up was one guy who we were considering having a report for us. He was a veteran, I'm not going to use his name, but a lot of you would have, I knew who he was at the time, and I was really excited to be working with him because he had a name, which is nice. But even though he had a name, we ran through the same exact process that everybody else went through, which was a long phone conversation with me where I told him, look, this is going to be a really different procedure, and we're not going to pay you a lot because we don't have a lot of money, and you're just going to have to either love the editing process or probably it's not going to work out. And I said, one of the things, I listed all the things that we were going to do, and I said, we're going to call your sources, and he said, absolutely not. You'll undermine my sources, and you'll undermine me and my sources' eyes. And I said, I don't think that's true, I disagree with that. I think that they'll, but there's just no way around it. So we gave up, we lost a guy who, he would have brought us a lot of readers, but he just wasn't going to play nice, and, or play whatever that was. And that was but he was the only time that ever actually came up. But he had developed sources. I don't know. I don't know why they would have been upset, but maybe it's legitimate, maybe a concern. But we didn't encounter it at that, to my recollection, and we would have just had to say, too bad. We can't just let people write stuff. Really quickly, if you have
Really quick, just what did you do if a source said, no, I don't like that quote, or that paraphrase doesn't represent me, I'd like to give you a different quote?
We usually let them. I mean, the quote, our journalists, for the most part, recorded the interviews. So if it was a direct quote, we didn't call, because they had a recording of it. But if it was a paraphrase and we were, we're trying to represent what this person says or what they think, and so, we want them to feel that it's accurate, an accurate representation of their opinions. So we usually let them. Can you think of any examples?
You wouldn't believe how many people will stand by something crazy too. Like, I remember talking to a major in the U.S. Army and saying, it was like some kind of quote that was just awful. Like she basically said, like if an Iraqi was beat up, it was probably because they deserved it. And I was like, I didn't know if that's what you meant. I think what you meant was they were resisting or whatever. You don't really mean like they just. It was something similar to this. And I read it back to her. And she says, not only, she just said it was accurate, but she's being very Army-like, right? She might have wished she didn't say it, but she didn't ask to change it. I didn't prompt her to ask to change it because I sort of loved that she said it, but I was like, is this correct that you said, if an Iraqi prisoner was beat up, he probably deserved it or something? She's like, yes, that's what I said. All right then. So they didn't really take the chance to change their story often, but it had to be that it was a misquote or a misrepresentation. They couldn't just say, oh, I prefer to have said this. It had to kind of be like, no, I don't believe that. So that's the kind of standard we use there.
Sorry, but wasn't the NewStandard the publication which first published that journal?
Yes.
And how did you fact check his sources? Also, he was going around Iraq and talking to civilians there with using translator, etc.
Yeah, he had to record it. We had to. The Dar Jamal is a reporter that we had who was in Baghdad. That was the hardest challenge that we had. Some of it we couldn't, some of it we had to just get him to verify multiple times. He recorded everything. Sometimes I asked him a couple of occasions, it was a pain in the ass. He had it on digital and he had to upload it, which was really hard. So that was the hardest thing, was that we couldn't call his sources nearly as often as we would. We didn't call everybody's sources, we spot checked this. What we had to do was make sure that the reporter knew, but Dar recorded everything. So he knew that I could spot check what he had recorded. The translator was the hardest part. I think maybe on one occasion I consulted an Arabic speaker to make sure that something was proper. It wasn't a fact check. It was kind of more like, is this a good translation? But that was weak. But that's the same with everybody. Everybody had to face that pretty much in the Western press. And I did most of for his stories, I did most of the contact to the Army. They didn't like him at all, so I wouldn't tell them who I was working with. They didn't know who the hell I was, and so they would talk to me, but they knew who he was, and they didn't want to talk to him. So most of the military stuff was me anyway.
And actually, when we started publishing the NewStandard, we thought we were doing international reporting. And I don't remember when we stopped, was it after that January? Yeah. We quickly realized that we were way in over our heads with international
because
reporting.
Of large
partly because and it's not just fact-checking the little quotes and stuff like that. It's really feeling like you understand the context enough to know that you're presenting the reader with all the voices that could be heard about this issue, etc. And we felt really confident in the U.S. doing that kind of reporting, but reporting on, you know, countries that we had no experience with just seemed like we couldn't do it.
So every new journalist got their sources called, the first 1 or 2 articles, at least spot checked within the article, often all the sources within the article, and they had to really pan out in order for us to develop trust. And then we spot checked everybody, and then anytime that there was suspicion, like, you know, not like we think you're lying, but, you know, maybe the reporter misunderstood this, we wanted to make sure. So that's pretty much, I think, the policy that we follow generally. Okay, so, and
So how did you document those checks if you did? So a system for...
I don't think we did.
I don't think we documented it.
We knew. I mean, if it came up within a week, we'd remember exactly the conversation that we had. Otherwise, I mean, yeah, we didn't make anyone fill out a form or anything. But we did, every time a reporter submitted a story, all of the sources, they knew that their sources would be called because we made them give the phone numbers with the submission of the story. So it wasn't, we might call you and then you have to run and try to tell your source, you know, I mean, we're like, there was no gaming this.
Because you write about the gratitude to objectivity is, I mean, were you upfront about the values that you espouse, or did you sort of hide them?
No, that's a really good point.
I just noticed that down at the end of the page, you can't see it there, there's a story about Google and privacy. And if you look at the headlines and just do the analysis on them, they're obviously coming from particular value positions, at least some of them. The Google one, I think, is at the very end.
Oh.
And it says something like, privacy concerns surrounding proposed Google. But maybe that's only 1 or 2 privacy groups. Maybe the rest of the world doesn't care or know. And maybe there are powerful industry bodies that are supporting it. So even though I agree with what you're saying, the privacy concerns probably do surround. Maybe it's only I mean, that's obviously coming from a particular perspective. So were you open about that?
Yeah. I mean, if you can't click any of this stuff because I don't have internet access, but all this stuff was background. I mean, you know, we couldn't put everything on the front page like kind, but we wouldn't have known how to present what we were. We wouldn't say we used the word leftist because we didn't feel that way. We often use progressive in our promotion stuff, and I think that progressive was like a term that we ended up using a lot, but we didn't like that either because it has, in the States, it kind of means Democrat. In fact, we got in trouble when we were applying for our nonprofit status. They said progressive means Democrat, so prove that you're not a political organization. It was really weird. So we had a lot of trouble with that. We had to do it in writing. We had to actually spell it out, and over time, you know, but whether we presented it or not as you know, it was here and we never hid it, per se. But it wasn't in each story, and here's why we're reporting this way, or that kind of thing.
And we certainly never said we were objective.
Yeah, we never used that word.
None of us believed that objectivity was possible.
In fact, Noam Chomsky, when Noam first, I sent something to Noam, an interview that someone had done, and the interviewer used the word objective and we didn't. And Noam sent me something about, you know, why are you using the word objective about journalism? I think he had just misread that the interviewer had said it or something, and we were hyper aware after that. We were like, no one says we definitely shouldn't do that, you know. So I know we never used it.
Considered objectivity is a legal requirement back home for a public broadcaster. It's actually in the law. Do you know what I mean? Even though
good luck. I mean, it's like I don't even know. We couldn't have said we were objective because we don't know what that means. We're
my feeling
humans.
is you could be on Mars and be objective.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think
You heard the word more objective in there. We sometimes use the term more objective, meaning more removed, but you can't be purely objective. So whenever you say, oh, we need to move on. I'm sorry.
yeah. So I think the next topic is our workplace structure. How much time? So
We can go over that. Someone else can.
So our workplace structure was, I'll just give it in really briefly. At our height, we had 6 staff. When we shut down, we had 5. We were actually looking to replace our 6th person who left. We operated as a collective. We had no hierarchy in the organization. We all made decisions together. We all got paid exactly the same salary. And we were organized kind of based on the principles of participatory economics. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that economic model, but if you aren't, you should check it out. It's very inspiring, and it inspired us. And the way that we implemented that vision in our workplace was we had balanced job complexes, which meant that every worker in collective had a mixture of tasks that ranged from very empowering work, which for us was our content production work, recording, editing, etc., all the way down to really boring, answering the email, copying, pasting, website code, bookkeeping, etc. And we made sure that everybody had a balanced, or as balanced as we could, mix of those kinds of tasks in the organization, so that we could balance empowerment across the organization and no one was stuck doing shit work while other people were doing empowering work. And that therefore everyone was able to come to the table in the decision-making process with equal empowerment and access to information and knowledge of the organization and stake in the organization.
So even if you weren't the bookkeeper, you could say, I want to see the books today, and you get to see the books.
And as the
Good luck,
bookkeeper,
good luck asserting them, but
as the
we tried to
bookkeeper, I
develop
would
that
have
skill.
loved to have help on the books. What else about our workplace structure?
Well, I mean, to picture it, it was actually, we all worked from home.
Yeah,
We
we
started
did.
with an office, but it was so expensive, well, it wasn't expensive, but it wasn't necessary, and we started working from home, and actually, we did a collective, like daily meetings, like collective process through chat,
Conference
conference
calls.
calls, like, just using technology, and it worked really well, even though it was, I think it was something we were most nervous about, was like, you can't have this kind of thing without face-to-face meetings. And that wasn't the problem at all. They went very well. The meetings went really well.
Yeah, I mean, we had face-to-face retreats a few times a year where we would discuss like bigger stuff for a couple days straight of meetings, but all the other meetings were conference calls
Because we
and
have people
discussions over email.
scattered all over the northeastern U.S.
I don't know if there's anything else about our workplace structure that you...
No, but I think probably if anyone wants to ask questions about how we did it or how it might apply in some ways we did a lot of thinking beforehand about how to do this. In fact, it's the thing that we had most concretely understood. When we went into it.
Is the sharing of different tasks across an organisation kind of compulsory in the sense that it's a duty as well as an opportunity to try out a different sort of job than what you've been used to? So I'm just wondering what would have happened if, say, it would have been somebody's turn to do the accounts and they were crap at it.
Well, we didn't rotate. We didn't. I mean, that's part of the cool thing about a balanced job complex. I mean, a lot of places, just out of fairness, will rotate tasks, and we did rotate some tasks, like answering the email. I think switched back and forth between a couple different people, but we just made sure that we all had comparable tasks on the scale of empowerment or shit work. So while I was the only bookkeeper of the NewStandard, that task did not rotate to other people. And when I started doing the books, I had no idea what I was doing. Actually, that's not true. Simone was the first bookkeeper. When she left, I took over the books. And I had no idea what I was doing, and I learned. And so while I was doing that, other people had other jobs that were kind of equal to that on the scale of empowerment, like answering the email. Brian had a lot of boring copying and pasting website code, because he was the website developer. And we just sort of made sure that everybody had comparable tasks balanced out.
We recognized that specialization was critical, and that rotating made no sense because you didn't want something to land on the lap. No one's going to rotate, and I coded the website from scratch. I wrote a couple 100,000 lines of computer code to make this thing happen, and that wasn't going to rotate onto somebody. It was a skill I brought to it, and I really wanted to leave me.
And it was the same with recording and editing. I mean, we did have overlap in that area. I did do a lot of recording and a lot of writing, and the people who were mainly reporters did a lot of editing of me and each other. But we did focus. My focus was on editing, and their focus was on reporting, and they got better at reporting than I did. And I got better at editing than they did, because you get good at what you do normally.
I disagree that anyone was better at recording than me, but that was rare. It's not normal that people could. That's true about me. What you just said is true about me. If you want to go and search our stories, you can tell what I'm talking about. The stories that my name is on aren't nearly as good as the ones that you won't see my name on.
Do you have other questions about the?
Did you ever try and expand to more than 6 people, or did you, because consensus and participatory organizing is really, I've found really challenging with a big group of people. So 6, 7, you know, that's a really ideal number, I would imagine, to be able to efficiently make decisions as well as run an entire daily paper. So did you try and expand beyond that, or did you?
We didn't have the opportunity, we didn't have the funding. I wish we could have. We didn't operate only on consensus. We were very picky about how we made decisions. We actually had a policy, a decision-making policy that laid out when consensus was necessary. And basically, I mean, the general guidelines behind it was if the decision was going to impact the organization in a huge, big way, it needed consensus. Like if we were going to change our mission or you know, do some big things like change our hiring, you know, changing our standard, our policy on certain standards, etc. That would have needed consensus, but for other decisions, we didn't need to use consensus. And we used a lot of different forms of decision making. We used varying degrees of supermajority vote. We based on, you know, the severity of the decision and how it was going to impact. We also recognized that some decisions would impact certain members of the collective more than others, and in those decisions there was like weighted voting. We also, for budgeting, for instance, we were like, well, how much are we going to spend on X in the budget? If we didn't immediately agree on a number, we'd discuss it quickly. We'd all kind of get a sense of what we wanted to spend in our heads, and a lot of times we would just average it. We would all throw out a number and we'd do the average. Sometimes we went forward with more than one decision, more than one option. So we really tried to make the decision-making process as easy and quick as possible. We broke up into committees for certain things to allow people to, you know, we would discuss things for a while, get a sense of the group. A committee would go form a more formal proposal to bring back to the group. So we try to save our time that way. I mean, I don't know what it would have been like in a larger group using those methods, but I think
we predicted what it would be like, and we set the thing up to scale massively. I mean, our intention was to have, hey, if we could have a 50-person workplace or 50-person firm, that's what we would have had. And we set this thing up to scale. Hiring and firing wouldn't have needed to be consensus if we had multiple workplaces and you didn't have to deal with everybody every day. We kept that kind of thing consensus because, hey, you're in an intimate situation with them, you need to not hate the person. But I mean, that's one of the things that would have scaled perfectly was, you know, reduce the burden of decision through scaling. So we had it set up to do sensibly. We were eager to try it. And I've done consensus in large groups that have diverse things, and I know exactly the problems that you're talking about. And we just weren't going to let anything be held up by consensus that didn't need to be. And consensus, right? We used a form of consensus that I had been practicing for a long time, which was that you don't have to agree with the decision, you just have to accept it. So if everybody else wants it, you need to just say, I don't like this, I want my dissent recorded, I think it's a bad decision. It's happened a couple times, but I am not going to hold this up. I accept that the group is probably wiser than I am, and that's that.
And we also had rules about when you could block. And it really had to do with if it really violated your principles and your values, or if you thought it was going to irreparably damage the mission of the organization. You know, there was like a pretty high bar for blocking consensus.
I don't think it came to it, but the group could override it technically. If you couldn't convince us that you had the right reasons, we could do that. Now, if we really didn't do that responsibly, it would have been a big mess. So everyone realized that these kind of things had to be done responsibly because we really did have to deal with everybody on a day-to-day basis, and everyone had to feel treated fairly. And we had, I won't go into it, but we had a disciplinary process that we collectively developed toward the very end when we really needed it. People weren't sometimes holding up every bit of their responsibilities. And the person who it was sort of used against the most contributed very heavily to the process.
She was on the committee that decided.
Yeah, she took it. I mean, you know, she took her lumps and she went through it, and she felt it was fair, you know. And if she didn't think it was fair, she brought it up and we listened and we said, maybe this isn't fair. So, you know, the workplace was pretty smooth, and we would have loved the chance to scale it, really. Maybe just one. Maybe we can take your question and then.
I know later may cover this, but I want to know if there's a way on your website.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
On your website where one could see sort of like written policies or guidelines that we could look at that sort of inform anyone that wants to set up some sort of local.
Yeah, on the homepage of the media conference for this conference, our thing is, if you scroll down a bit, you'll see a link to it. Our names are there, I think, in the NewStandard, and there's a link to our manual that has most of the stuff.
If you want, I mean,
If you want the nitty-gritty stuff.
we had the decision-making policy, bylaws, and our accountability policy, which was the disciplinary policy that Brian was just talking about. We have those in writing. We would be happy to share them. So I guess if you emailed us, we could email them to you.
Yeah,
We should probably just put them up on the NewStandard website.
I'll get to it. Yeah. But we need to be prompted for that. So yeah, because we get requests and I never seem to put them up there.
So my email address is jessica@disconnection.org. If you email me, I will send you those documents.
Okay, we have very little time left, so I want to move on and talk about the really big question that I know a lot of you have, which is about funding.
So can I just say one thing? Is it possible in your scheme of things, or that we could make time for a couple of minutes on discussion about the design, and you tell us how you arrived at that?
The design? No, I couldn't care less. It's not necessarily good, and I don't have any big instructions to say about it. It was a long process of it came about, but I'd be happy to talk with you about it. I was involved in the design. We all were involved in the design, but again, it's just one of those things that, like, that it looked this way isn't what we think about or talk about, because it's what it is. But we're proud about certain things, and other things we dug it, but it wasn't great. It was heavily critiqued by a lot of people. Actually, a lot of people didn't like it, which was fair enough. But I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards. But what we did do that was unique, the thing that we really want to convey to people, other than the workplace structure and the way we went about gathering stories, was the way we funded ourselves. We wanted to be able to call ourselves, quote unquote, truly independent. And what that really meant was we had to be more independent than, kind of anybody else that we knew of, or as independent as anybody else that we knew. And the only other really independently funded media organization that we knew of was Z, which I had worked with extensively, and Jessica had worked with some. And I had actually helped build their fundraising model, their funding model with Michael. And so we kind of adapted it for what we did. But the main principles were no advertising. That we don't ever want to hear from someone that we didn't, that we said something contradicted their message in their ad. But more importantly, this thing nobody thinks about. If you're advertising funded, your job is to get eyeballs to advertisers. You're selling your audience to advertisers. That's a completely different way to look at what you're doing. We were just plain disgusted by it. Sometimes we understand, sometimes it's necessary, but we just cringed at the thought of it. And what it really means is you're trying to create a mass audience because you want to provide more eyeballs to your advertisers.
Or a rich audience, or some kind
you
of
either had to have a
audience
specialized audience or a gigantic audience. And that's what happens to media. That's what they're thinking all the time. We did not accept grants because of the same thing. We didn't want strings attached. Grants often they're often very open, except for that whole thing about how they're for environmental coverage, which we were doing. We could have applied for a grant for environmental coverage, but they would have said, produce this much environmental content, and we would have had to promise it, and they would have made us do it, and it would have offset our balance, because we didn't think environmental coverage was 3 times as important as human rights coverage, or whatever. I don't know what the actual content of those discussions were, but we had some kind of balance that we thought was appropriate. We didn't want it influenced by outside money. So those were the key things that were, the way people usually do this. We didn't have subscribers, and the internet, as you all know, is this place where you can kind of keep information from people unless they give you a credit card and, you give them a login and password. But we didn't go that route. We had kind of a plan to eventually do some of that, like maybe put special features, stuff behind kind of the quote-unquote paywall. But really what we launched with, and what we stayed with, even though it wasn't exactly our business plan, was this open site. So anybody could come and see this. It was a public good. Anybody could use it however they wanted, and they sure as hell did, like other sites. No, not as much as we would have wished in a lot of ways, but because of that, we had to just ask for donations, and we didn't keep anything from you. You didn't get anything particularly special. I think you got a newsletter on Sunday.
Near the end, you got a newsletter.
It wasn't really good.
It was like once a month or something.
We tried. It was really cool in a way, but it was a lot of work, and by the end of the week, we were kind of like, screw the newsletter. So it wasn't anything that you would donate for. So we just wanted to be reader funded, and every penny that we ever took was reader funded. We even got massive donations, but the people that gave them to us, like $65,000. We got a $65,000 donation from someone who came to us as a reader, who wrote for technical support, or wrote about some article, but I had no idea who the guy was. And I wrote him back we wrote everybody back, and we gave him a thorough, respectful response. And he said, "Oh, you just impressed me, and by the way, I'm super rich." And he started dumping money on us. But I did not know that, and then we had a policy for that guy and a few other people who gave us large amounts of money. If he ever wanted to comment about our content again, he had to do it through an anonymous email address. I would not open an email or read an email or share with anybody else. It happened once or twice, a little bit of leaning, like, "Oh, I wish you'd do more of this," from one of our donors. I didn't tell anybody else in the collective when I heard that from somebody. It couldn't influence our content, so we had a really strict rule about that. You won't find that very much, because people really don't want to stop at that point. It's very hard to tell someone. I had to tell the donor on the phone. I actually don't want, he wanted us to do some story about cars or something, I can tell you now. And he's like, "Why don't you do something about the number of cars on the road or something?" And I was like, "Look, put it in an email, it's anonymous," but actually don't do that one, because now I know that it's weird. So we walked a fine line. Our finances were intense. So I told you that we started with $10,000 that I think came in like days before we launched in January, or maybe a couple weeks before or something. And our final budget in 2006 was $185,000. All of it raised this way. The way we approached this was we never got credit, we never spent money that we didn't have. When we would get a large donation, we would always do it, but we wouldn't accept a penny of it until we had a plan for how we were going to increase our general revenues until they would not be dependent on that donation next year. So we had a plan for building our readership and drawing money from them. This was, what we did was so impressive. I'm so proud of it, because we worked our asses off on it, and it's just something that anybody can do. You need this model to get out there. We were making $14.70-something per month off of every donation we had, excluding the large ones that were $1,000 or more. So if someone gave us a donation of $1,000, I'm not counting that into that budget.
I'll read you the statistics.
Okay. Yeah.
Excluding those who contributed more than $1,000 a year. So basically our model was, people could sign up with their credit card and we would take a small amount, whatever they said. They could set the amount.
Minimum was like 3, because it had to be worth us charging it.
Right, because with their credit card fees. So you would put in how much you want to be charged a month, and then we would charge you a recurring donation every month. So the average periodic contribution, excluding those who gave it more than $1,000 a year, was $14.72 a month, which amounts to $176.66 per year. That's an average from what our small donors were giving us. And based on our analysis of our website traffic, we think that as many as 1 in 6 of our regular readers were donors, which meant that we raised $46 per daily reader per year.
There's nothing that I've ever heard of, and I've been challenging people to come up with something that's remotely close to that, including pornography. I suspect that there's probably some kind of people who are extracting that kind of money from their small little group or whatever, but we were getting people to contribute voluntarily without telling them they had to do it at a level that, CNET is the second best that I've ever heard of, and they were averaging about $5 or $6 at the same time from their much larger pool of donors. So they were making more money in the aggregate, but per person, we were the only thing like what we were doing, and so people were willing to shell out for it.
We had a pretty small readership, but the readers who found us and stayed with us loved us. And I think that the recurring donation, the monthly donation, is something that everybody should just take back to their organizations, because if we had been asking people for $176 at one time, that would have been a no-go. But, people just donating, $10, $15, $20 a month that was much easier for them. And it was hassle-free because they just put their credit card in and it got charged every month.
Sorry, you just said for those who found you, how much did you promote yourself, or how did you try and do
There's the question for the conclusion of our little story.
We weren't very good at that. And we went into this actually thinking that we would get a lot more solidarity from our peers in the alternative media world. We did get some really significant solidarity, especially from ZNet, who, after we've been publishing almost no time at all, wrote all of their donors and told their donors to donate to us, which was an amazing gift. And they did that multiple times. But the rest of the alternative media, most of them pretty much ignored our existence, even though we asked them over and over again to link to us, even though they were linking to corporate news stories about the same things that we were reporting on. It was very frustrating, and we never really got an explanation for why we were shut out from like the shared linking environment. And it became really hard for us to get the word out, because I think that that's really the free promotion that happens in the alternative media world, is cross-linking. And we didn't have a budget to do promotion. We talked about promotion a lot. We tried to come up with ideas to promote ourselves. We spent a lot of time writing websites and writing people and trying to get them interested in us, and it was really difficult. And that really was the reason that we shut down, because as big as our budget was, the kind of reporting that we were doing was so time-consuming. We needed a larger staff even to just maintain this. And in order to grow our content so that it would be appealing to a bigger audience, just because we have more topics that people might be interested in reading about, we needed an even larger staff, and we were not able to grow, and we burned out.
And the marketing feature is something that the scaling would have helped. We couldn't afford to have someone who was a marketing specialist on as part of their balanced job complex, that instead of writing, or editing, that they would produce sort of marketing work, that they would do the marketing work as their kind of empowering job, pushing the new standard out there. That would be the first thing. We wouldn't, I wouldn't start something like this without that again.